Let's go ahead and move on to the muscular system, and specifically we'll talk about skeletal muscle. Now recall earlier we discussed the three different types of muscles when we talked about tissues. Muscle tissue, there's cardiac muscle, there's smooth muscle, and skeletal muscle. So we're going to focus on the skeletal muscle today. Let's take a look at the gross anatomy or the macroscopic anatomy. When we look at a muscle here, here's the bone, and the muscle is attached to the bone by means of a tendon, which is a, of course, dense, regular connective tissue. All right. The origin of a muscle is the attachment site that moves the least. The insertion of a muscle, so let's say this muscle continues on here and attaches to another bone, the insertion is the attachment site that moves the most. So if you look at every muscle, there's a part that's a site that's anchored and a part that moves. The origin is the part that's anchored that moves very little, and the insertion is the end that moves the most. All right, if we section that muscle here and we take a closer look at it, we can see the parts of that muscle. Okay. Now, the muscle is surrounded by connective tissue layers, and this is called fascia. There's an outer layer that surrounds the whole muscle, and then layers within that muscle, which we'll talk about in a second. So this outer layer is called the epimysium. Okay, so dense irregular connective tissue surrounds the whole muscle. The whole muscle then can be divided up into individual sections called fascicles. So each one of these sections here is called a fascicle. Now, a fascicle comes from the word that means like a bundle of sticks, I believe, because these are like tubular cylindrical structures that are arranged like sticks next to each other. We're going to see that term later on, and just kind of put that somewhere in your mind, and you can pull that out later. All right, so we have these bundles here called fascicles, and I pulled out a fascicle. Now notice that each fascicle is surrounded by a connective tissue layer, and this one is called the paramecium. Okay, peri means around. All right, now each fascicle can be further subdivided into structures called muscle cells or muscle fibers. All right, so this structure here muscle cell or muscle fiber. And remember that skeletal muscle cells are multinucleate. Okay, many nuclei, due to the fact of many cells coming together to form these fibers or these cells. And each one of these muscle fibers or muscle cells are further surrounded by another connective tissue membrane or connective tissue layer called the endomysium. This endomysium is a thin layer of areolar connective tissue. Notice each muscle fiber or muscle cell is further subdivided into structures called myofibrils. Okay, so that's a myofibril. So let's go ahead and take a little closer look at the microscopic anatomy. So we're going to look at the level of the muscle fiber or the muscle cell and the myofibrils and take just a little closer look. And again, remember, we're talking about skeletal muscles. So microscopic. of the skeletal muscle. All right, so let's go ahead and we'll, what color was that? Was that red? Will we draw our, let's see, here's our muscle cell or muscle fiber. And remember that it was surrounded by the paramecium. I mean the endomysium, sorry. The connective tissue layer. But it is a cell, so there is a cell membrane called the sarcolemma. The sarcolemma is the plasma membrane, or the cell membrane, of the muscle fiber or the muscle cell. All right, and recall that each muscle fiber or muscle cell is composed of these myofibrils that I pulled out there. Okay, so now each myofibril is further subdivided into sections. And each section is called a sarcomere. So this whole thing is a myofibril. Now the sarcomere is really the functional unit of the skeletal muscle cell, okay, or the skeletal muscle. So we're going to take a look at a single sarcomere here. Take a look at this sarcomere there. So just one region, and what we have in a myofibril are repeating sarcomeres, repeating units that repeat over and over and over. Okay, and it's arrangement of the proteins within the sarcomere that gives the skeletal muscle its striped appearance. So let's take a look at what is found within a sarcomere. Now the sarcomere is made up of proteins, protein filaments, called myofilaments. Some are thick, and some are thin. Okay. Now the thin or the thick filament or myofilament is made up of a protein called myosin. And the thin filament is made up of mainly the protein actin. But it's got some other structures, other proteins that make up the thin filament, and I wonder if I should put that here. There is a structure called tropomyosin and troponin. So I'm going to put that here. Troponin, and tropomyosin. I'll put it up here. Okay, so the thin filament is made up of actin, troponin, and tropomyosin. And we'll take a look at how muscle contraction occurs in another video, but you need to know the basic anatomy. Now these divisions where the sarcomere begins and ends is called the Z-line. or the Z disc. Maybe I'll keep with the book. The Z disc. Here and here's a Z disc. Okay. Now the myosin molecules have these structures, these heads they call them, that protrude from the thick filament like this. And we'll see the importance of those in our next video. Alright, so that's just the overview, the macroscopic or the gross anatomy as well as the microscopic anatomy of a skeletal muscle.